My topic for today is called Structural Violence and Collateral Damage on Globalization, of the U.S. nuclear enterprise. So what you see from these slides here, I want to quote something from Sandler, 2007. One cannot be on the side of social justice without questioning the practices, the study of knowledge, the methods and frameworks that contribute to the structure and norms of injustice and oppression. And I think if you look at these four slides, what you see here is this whole history of imperialism and colonialism under, in the United States at the turn of the century. And each one of these pictures represents, that particular category, that mindset of this notion of manifest destiny on a global level. So as we talk about the globalization of the U.S. nuclear enterprise, I'm hoping that we will, through this process of getting people to understand, know, feel, and do what we want them to do, we have to articulate a new type of consciousness and have a new type of discourse about the global, the local, nuclear nationalism, human extinction, and the phantasmagoria of nuclear conflict and terror. So what is this process of globalization? We hear a lot about this word these days. You can see that it's about new governance structures, markets, communication, diffusion of information, mobility, cross-cultural interactions, environmental changes, and the things that, and how these changes affect the nature of human interactions across boundaries and borders, whether it's spatial, temporal, cognitive. And for me, as a health scientist, again, these are health policy discussions because it does deal with human security and health security, and not just trade and development and governance. So radioactive nation building. As we talk about the complexity of plutonium-239 and isotopes in this economy and the contamination of the public sphere, we get into this notion of what Mark Masco calls this nuclear uncanny, this psychic ability or this anesthetic quality that comes up where people feel haunted and untrustworthy of the process, and well they should for many different reasons. As a child, I read Hiroshima by John Hershey, and I've watched several other documentaries over the past time, and it's more horrible than what we can contemplate in that sense. But this whole issue of radioactive nation building, as we talk about the cradle to the grave lifetime of nuclear weapons economy, we're talking about uranium mining and all the problems that come with that. We're talking about nuclear weapons design and missile testing and nuclear waste storage. Those are the three big problems that have come about as we talk about this nuclear economy. So what's necessary for us to deal with this? Leadership. Leadership not only at the top level, but at the grassroots level as well. And must be global health leadership development, in terms of integrative thinking. When I talk about integrative thinking, I'm talking about how do we work, from the education perspective, how do we work across different disciplines? These problems are too complex to be solved with psychology alone, economics alone, or sociology alone. We need to look at the intersections of these disciplines to figure out how to solve this particular problem. One of the issues that I see is that what's happening in schools is that we teach this lifeboat scenario and this issue of resource scarcity. And so the trade-offs between collective good and individual rights. So as you can see here, I've got 7 problems sort of outlined as we talk about this issue, as we talk about the nuclear enterprise, and questions that we should ask. What is the ethical problem? What information is needed? Who are the stakeholders? What values are relevant to the problem? What options are available? What type of values are served in light of financial, political, and organizational constraints? And what process is best for decision making? Who makes it and who ought to be involved? If we're talking about an open participatory democracy, then everyday people at the grassroots level need to be involved in those conversations. It shouldn't be closed meetings like the one that's going on downstairs. That's by invitation only. So what are the values and social norms and the zeitgeist? What is the spirit of the day under this nuclear enterprise? I think in some questions we have to, in some ways we have to question that aspect of the American worldview. This notion that there's this rescue imperative or the rule of rescue, the technological imperative, the visibility imperative, and the individualism imperative. All 4 of these imperatives are very much grounded in this whole nuclear enterprise, as well as healthcare and education. For example, many years ago when I was a clinician, I was an adrenaline junkie. I loved the idea of being called to rush to the emergency room to help somebody. And I realized, like, wow, I'm seeing the same conditions day in and day out. How come we're not solving these problems? And so we have to start thinking differently about this. So this rescue imperative is not just immediate. Well, there's a rescue imperative, but how do we save our souls and our consciousness from further degradation into this quagmire? So critiques. Critiques are the beginning of engaged citizenship. So, as we talk about critiquing the nuclear enterprise, we should talk about domination and discrimination, human liberation, social transformation, democratic political action. And these are metatheorical revolutions. In some ways, I should say it should be a movement. It's not just a change, but it's a movement. It's a constant moving forward as we cycle through this to disengage ourselves from this process that's leading to so much destruction and harm. So as we talk about institutional racism and power, one of the things that I see that's going on with this is this supremacist ideologies. We talk about this neo-imperialism and this neo-colonialism, as they call it now, American exceptionalism. This whole supremacist ideology that I'm better than someone else, so therefore everyone else must be inferior. And so that mindset, that supremacist ideology, leads to discriminatory acts, it leads to structural dominance, and it leads to oppression. And by oppression, I'm talking about ageism, genderism, sexism, ableism, language issues, disability issues, and all those forms of oppression cause injustices, numerous types of injustices, whether it's distributive injustice, you know, and so forth and so on. And we can do a Q&A about that. Neoliberalism, neoconservatism. As a public health scientist, one of the things that I'm most interested in is dealing with root causes. Again, as a public health scientist, epidemiologist, I think that if you look at that graph to the left, you'll see the plant, the leaves above the ground. And too often we deal with symptoms of the problem. We deal with, you know, the effects, you know, the surface similarities. What I'm asking is that we should start doing deep structure analysis. Let's get down to the root of the problem. What's causing this in the first place? Classic example from healthcare, for example. Our healthcare budget is, you know, $2 trillion a year. 95% of that is spent on treatment, but only 5% is spent on prevention. When we know that the top 10 killers are 100% preventable. So we suffer from prevention deficit disorder. And the same may be said of what we're talking about with this nuclear enterprise as well. So we have to look at the root causes of this. And so as we look to the graph to the right, the graphic, we'll see that we have the flashlight is shining this light of institutional violence on the organizational culture, and how the organizational culture has an impact on, you know, the trunk of the tree as well as the leaves. And I'm saying that we have to start really thinking about getting down to the roots of the problem, and not just dealing with the effects. The corporatization of universities, example of that is going on today downstairs. You know, the modernization and nation building, it's economically capitalistic, socially pluralistic, and politically democratic march, so they claim. Traditionalism is seen as the enemy of progress, and traditionalism is seen as unprogressive distortion of authentic progress, and they're fostering social change for modernity. That's bureaucratic innovation. I like this copy of the American flag because rather than the stars, you see all the corporate logos. And clearly, we've commodified education. And for me, this is a problem because from a human rights perspective, education is a human right. Health is a human right. You know, but never, everyone is saying that we have to put a price tag on that. And it's very unfortunate. And at the bottom, you see the current UNM seal, which represents the frontiersmen and the conquistadors, and the impact that has had on the way we make it. So this secular new order, this Novus Ordo Seclorum, you know, as we talk about the corporatization and how this fits into the nuclear enterprise as well, we have to talk about the impact of business-driven globalization, IMF, the World Bank, WTO, GATT, NAFTA. And I say that because these are attacks on democracy and they support authoritarian rule. And these are authoritarians that may be favored later on to possess nuclear weapons as well. That increases financial volatility, third world debt crisis through structural assistance programs. But more importantly, the key to all this is that it downgrades the central place according to human rights. So it's a violation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenants of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the UN Charter, International Bill of Human Rights, as well as developmental programs. So the global public commons, you know, how does this figure into this? You know, as I said before, I'm talking about this light of structural violence on this problem, and how it has an impact on human security, human vulnerabilities, on social stability, conflict sensitivity, climate systems and climate sensibility, and natural resources and environmental vulnerabilities. We don't think enough about the global commons and the public goods that exist here. We have this notion where if we start to talk about the natural environment sustainability in many ways on indigenous knowledge, it's considered antiquated and out of step, and we're not being modern enough, and so we're disrespecting that. So this is just, you know, some of the global issues that happens on international development and changes that take place, and the problems with neoliberal education ideology. So a brief critique of this first part of neoliberalism, health inequities. We see that economic globalization, markets privatization, you know, is incorrect and produces perverse health outcomes, and neglects the relationships between economic, political, social health. It overlooks the need for political kinds of, particular kinds of political and social arrangements. These economies cannot translate economic improvements into overall improvement of well-being. And basically, these neoliberal doctrines are concerned with or positively endorse inequalities. And neoliberals are particularly individualistic in attacking various forms of collective or state action. And standards of living do not focus on human well-being, but only on macroeconomic indicators. So that's what's going on when we talk about this nuclear enterprise. They're more concerned about macroeconomic indicators and the wealth and development of a few, as opposed to the collective well-being of others. Oh, structural violence. Okay, violence is this unnecessary insult upon basic human needs, their survival, well-being, identity, freedom. And just like the opposite of health is disease, the opposite of peace is violence. Many times now that I've taken over the Peace and Justice Studies programs, people ask me, what is peace? I ask them, what is peace? And they have difficult times coming up with definitions for it. I said, but you know it by its absence. And that's the story I'm sticking with right now. You know peace, by its absence, so everything else must be violent. Okay? So, both disease and violence can affect individuals and whole societies. What you see right now with this graphic on the other side is, it used to be the east-west divide. Now it's the north-south divide as we talk about this. All the world's wealth is concentrated above the northern hemisphere. Most of the poverty and sickness and underdevelopment is below the equator. And so, as we talk about structural violence and social injustice, we're talking about economic, political, legal, religious, and cultural issues that stop individual groups and societies from reaching their full potential. And it's embedded in the political, economic organization of the world. And why is it violent? It causes injury to people, not typically not those responsible for perpetuating, such inequalities. Okay, so it can be physical and psychological harm to the individual because it's exploitive and unjust social, political, economic systems. Violence is a serious public health issue. Again, it can be direct, it can be structural, it can be cultural. And so peace is not merely the absence of violence, but it's the state of mutual beneficial relationships, fair structures, and a culture of peace. And it's the capacity to handle conflicts with empathy, creativity, by nonviolent means. I want to put this in here because Stephen Hawking said something that I thought was really interesting. And basically he said, technology is a driver of income inequality and poverty, human aggression over empathy. And he said the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. And I think as we play around with nuclear weapons and nuclear enterprise, that's what's going on. We're playing around with this illusion that we can do better, that we can control it. But as you can see here, the four things that Stephen Hawking's mentioned was atomic warfare, climate change, genetic engineering, and how those issues deal with war, materialism, and poverty. So what are the alert signs of this structural violence? Disease outbreaks, poverty line indicators, basic needs index, youth without jobs, food shortages, famine, violence, oppression, political instability, corruption, disintegration of government institutions, and migration of people. Let me move a little bit closer here because this is one of my favorite diagrams I want to show people when we talk about social determinants of health and why this is important. The tree that you see on the left here, which is pretty much a barren tree. But, as we talk about root cause analysis, below the ground here, you see this tree is trying to thrive on toxins that exist within the soil. And these toxins are poverty, marketing for tobacco and alcohol, unemployment, environmental toxins, nuclear waste, discrimination, institutional racism, occupational hazards, poor quality schools, adverse living conditions. And that leads to a branch of a tree that has disconnected members from society, disinvestment in communities, restrictions of power, fragmented systems, and the chronic stresses from trying to deal with these on a daily basis is what's causing these chronic disease conditions. So when inequities are high and community assets are low, health outcomes are the worst. Now let's move to a new paradigm here as we talk about this particular tree, which is obviously thriving. Okay, we see jobs, we see quality housing, we see health insurance, we see adequate incomes, living wages, we see access to recreation facilities, quality schools, access to healthy foods, clean environments, access to healthcare, transportation issues. And when a tree feeds on these roots, you have organizational networks, political influence, leadership, participation, social support, social networks, and thriving communities. And stresses are less, so these disease conditions are even lessened. And this is something we're still trying to get medical students to understand, that when inequities are low and income assets are, the community assets are high, health outcomes are at their best. And so, as I said before, this is still a work in progress for me, but I'm going to start to add this nuclear enterprise into this tree diagram to demonstrate it a little bit more clearly also too, as we talk about environmental justice. So collateral damage. Martin Luther King, in one of his speeches, once said that the three enemies of mankind are racism, economic exploitation, militarism, the triple evils. And he also said that the U.S. government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And so I want to talk a little bit about unnatural causes, inequality making us sick. And talk a little bit now about the Marshallese people and their experience and the price that they paid to help the U.S. maintain a strategic military presence in the Pacific. So atomic testing and challenges to population health. You know, you see the Republic of the Marshall Islands and some of the demographics there. The bottom map shows the displacement of people due to nuclear testing in the Pacific Basin. Well, what I want to say is that this is an issue where people have been exposed to nuclear radiation over a period of time, and the equivalent of radiation that they received was the equivalent of 12 Hiroshimas per day for 12 years. That's not a nuclear radiation. Security, again, quote Martin Luther King, do we want chaos or do we want community? We have to talk, when we talk about the nuclear enterprise, we have to talk about the health of the total Earth ecosystem, health of cities and their socioeconomic components, the health of diverse populations, you know, the color line and chaos of community, structural racism, institutionalized racism under neoconservatism and neoliberal ideology support, either deals with more poverty, the issues of corporations and militarism. And it says corporations under the Supreme Court ruling under the slaughterhouse cases basically says that corporations have human rights, corporations have personhood. And if you ever watch the film Corporations, you'll see that corporations come out highly rated as being sociopathic in nature. You know, this graph shows you, military spending. You know, the large purple bubble there represents the $800 billion that U.S. spends on military. The rest shows our competitors, our closest rivals and competitors, what that means. So as we talk about the landscapes and structural violence that people live under the nuclear umbrella, we'll see that people, don't have choice, but they have constraints. It's not necessarily the terrain, but the severe limits imposed on human thoughts and actions, and what those disparities and inequalities are. And again, forgive me for going so quickly, but human suffering under collateral damage and structural violence. Again, poorly designed policies that yield inadequate food, housing, health, and safe working conditions. People living a life under oppression, exclusion, exploitation, marginalization. And again, New Mexico's nuclear colony is another example that when you look at the northern Rio Grande Valley and the things that have happened over the last 50 years. And the most vulnerable populations, women, children, and elders. Those from different ethnic, racial groups and things. So peace, I'm going to wrap this up by saying that, in order to bring about this peace, we need mindfulness. We need intentionality. We need to think about our human consciousness, how we improve it in terms of our awareness of space and energy, life unknown, time and matter, and what are the metaphysical issues behind all of that, which are overlooked. What the mindful process is to undo this notion of human suffering, particularly caused by Western science tradition, and reduction of human suffering. And then one of my favorite graphs about the mindfulness. I taught a class in educational environmental psychology once, and this is out of the textbook. And you see plotted here on time and space. If you look at all these data points, you see where human consciousness and where human beings are pretty much situated around, over time in the present, between 1 year or so, all those data points between, it's about self, family, community. But when you get down to the far side of this in space and time, look at the data points, how many people even think about the world? Few to none. And so this is what I mean about mindfulness as we talk about this nuclear enterprise and all these other issues. How do we integrate this thinking and this thought, so that we view the whole world as global commons? Public of learning communities. What I'm trying to do with my Peace Studies program is create new knowledge, research and technology transfer, and how that's going to be used for culture and community development, and the interactions of institutional change. Well, this particular graph is we talk about SBSS, science-based stockpile stewardship, which is basically what they're talking about downstairs, how to make nuclear weapons, the old nuclear weapons safer, so they say. But this, as we look at this 2x2 table, we have to say, as we talk about social change, no. Social change versus institutional behavior change. If there's no social change and there's no institutional behavior change, then there's the maintenance of the status quo, okay? If there's no social change and there's some institutional change, we have limited institutional improvement. But if we have social change, yes, we have increased potential for institutional improvement, particularly if there's institutional behavior change, but this is where we want to be. Social change with institutional behavior change, so there's self-sustained institutional improvements. And this is what we have to merge out of our institutions, organizations, as we undo these harms. Fundamental principles for health and all policies, conditions and resources. This is from the WHO, World Health Organization. And basically, these are their comments, not mine, but I agree to them in terms of conditions and resources. We need peace, we need shelter, we need education, we need food. This is what human beings need for human security. Peace, shelter, education, food, income, a stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice, and equity. And these are the principles for that: legitimacy, accountability, transparency, participation, sustainability, collaboration. Ethical framework needs to include solidarity, efficacy, integrity, dignity, the harm principle, principle of least restrictive means, reciprocity, and transparency, rather than old clinical biomedical model. And integrating peace building skills into global health governance and practice. This is what I'm trying to help our students to do: understand conflict analysis, negotiation, mediation, and facilitation, dialogue on conflict issues, giving voice to marginalized communities, advocacy, establish relations across the divides, trust building, peace building, and conflict transformation education, responding to culture and historical psychosocial trauma, monitoring evaluation. So basically, I do this for the generation that's coming behind me. And as Martin Luther King said, cowardice asks the questions, is it safe? Expediency asks the questions, is it politic? Vanity asks the questions, is it popular? But conscience asks the questions, is it right? And so there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor political nor popular, but one must have it simply because it is the right thing to do. So as we talk about undoing, the nuclear enterprise, it's the right thing to do. Thank you. Sorry for listening.